Shortly afterwards, newspapers worldwide printed the announcement that Hitler is dead.
The sights and sounds of victory in Europe echo across the Atlantic and around the world.
This death certificate is produced without the presence of physical evidence. That gave way rather quickly to suspicion. And that suspicion was based on the fact that there was no body.
Most people think Hitler's story ended in a bunker in Berlin. For one FBI agent, it did not end there at all. From rumors that Hitler fled by submarine to claims that he shaved his mustache and slipped into the Andes, he logged it all. His notes were hidden for decades. Now they are public, and what they reveal is far stranger than the myths. Why Hitler's death never felt final. In the last weeks of the war in Europe, Adolf Hitler was trapped under a ruined city. Soviet troops closed in on Berlin from every side. Above ground, his government fell apart. Below ground, in a concrete shelter behind the old chancellery, he spent his last days giving orders to divisions that no longer existed and listening to the artillery move closer. Inside that underground shelter, later known as the bunker, the circle around him kept shrinking. Eva Braun came down to join him. A few loyal ministers and guards moved their families inside because they knew the city was about to fall. By late April, there was almost no way out. Hitler refused to flee. On April 30th, 1945, he and Eva Braun killed themselves in a small room. Their bodies were carried up the stairs, laid in a shallow crater in the garden, soaked in fuel, and burned as Soviet shells fell nearby. Soviet units reached the ruins soon after and quietly took charge of the remains. For the Western Allies, certainty stopped there. The only people who had seen those last minutes were German. The first people who handled the bodies were Soviet. American and British officers never had a corpse they could examine. They had to rely on witness stories and on whatever the Soviets chose to share. Soviet statements did not match each other. Some said it was a gunshot, others said poison, and a few officers even hinted the body might have been a double. From the outside, it was impossible to tell what was an honest mistake and what was done on purpose. Joseph Stalin quickly turned that confusion into a weapon. In June of 1945, his Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov told reporters in Berlin that Soviet forces had not found Hitler and that he might have escaped. At the Potsdam meeting a few weeks later, Stalin told Western leaders that Hitler could be hiding in Spain or Argentina. He had no proof, but once the Soviet leader said he was not sure Hitler was dead, newspapers around the world treated the idea of an escape as something that had to be taken seriously. Public opinion followed. In the summer of 1945, polls found that roughly 2/3 of Americans thought Hitler might still be alive somewhere. 2 years later, after a British intelligence officer named Hugh Trevor Roper interviewed bunker witnesses and published a book called The Last Days of Hitler, a national poll showed that almost half of Americans still did not believe Hitler was dead. The war was over on maps, but for millions of people, the thought that the man who started it might still be on the run never fully went away. No one in Washington hated loose ends more than J. Edgar Hoover. By the end of the war, he had already led the Federal Bureau of Investigation for many years. He saw enemies everywhere, from gangsters to foreign spies to communists, and he believed that any small tip might hide a real threat. For Hoover, the question of whether Hitler had really died was not a topic for historians. It was a live security problem. Hoover could see that the confusion was global. News stories spoke of a manhunt stretching from Berlin to Buenos Aires, with Allied forces tracking down every clue in case the suicide story turned out to be a hoax. Reports of Hitler sightings reached intelligence services from all over. No one in Hoover's position wanted to explain, years later, that the Bureau had ignored a tip that turned out to be real. Inside the Bureau, the response was simple. Hitler became an open case. Field offices were told to log and check information that suggested he might still be alive. Most of the tips that poured in were small and vague, like claims that an old man in a small town looked exactly like Hitler. The FBI files show that agents wrote down these stories, checked what they could, and again ended their notes by saying that the information could not be confirmed. Against that background of noise, one early report from California still stands out. It began in Los Angeles in September of 1945. The Bureau's field office there sent a report to headquarters. On the first page, the subject line carried a blunt title in capital letters: Hitler Hideout. The writer's name is hidden under thick black ink in the surviving copy, but his work is still easy to follow. The report summed up a tip that came through a reporter on the city desk of the Los Angeles Examiner. That reporter had met a friend for lunch at a restaurant at Hollywood and Vine, where the friend introduced him to a man who claimed he had been part of a plan to move Hitler to safety after the fall of Berlin. According to the report, this man said he had helped several high-ranking Argentine officials when they received Hitler from a submarine and moved him toward the foothills of the southern Andes. He said he knew the route, the ranch, and the nearby town. In the memo, the informant sounds frightened. He told the reporter that he wanted to speak with a high-level American official who could promise that he would not be sent back to Argentina if he told everything he knew, and he hinted that powerful people in Argentina would not forgive him if he talked too freely. The same report also includes the Bureau's own warning. The information could not be verified, efforts to find the main source had failed, and there was no record of him in police or immigration files. Those pages are only the beginning. The same tip that started over lunch at a Hollywood restaurant pointed toward a dangerous coastline, a remote ranch in the hills, and a well-connected woman in South America who believed that Hitler should have won. Inside the FBI's wildest Hitler file. The tip says that about 2.5 weeks after Berlin fell, 2 German submarines appeared off the coast of Argentina. The first submarine came in close at night to test the shoreline and to put men ashore. A few hours later, a second submarine arrived. That second boat, the man claims, carried Hitler, 2 doctors, several aides, and 2 women. In the memo, the agent records that this landing did not happen at a busy harbor. It was supposed to be a quiet, remote beach, reached at night. Small boats ferried the passengers from the submarine to land. On the shore, local contacts waited with transport. The source says he was one of 4 men who met Hitler at that beach and helped move him inland. From there, the story shifts away from the sea and into the mountains. According to the report, the group rode on horses for roughly a full day to reach a ranch in the foothills of the southern Andes. The informant places this ranch in an area he links to real towns, naming places around San Antonio and other locations in Rio Negro and Neuquén provinces. He describes the ranch as isolated, guarded, and supported by friendly German families in the region. The file also records how the source describes Hitler himself. He says Hitler has shaved off his famous moustache, which makes his upper lip look oddly shaped. He claims Hitler is suffering from asthma and stomach ulcers and shows a mark or scar on his face. The informant does not stop at one ranch. In a separate letter that also ends up in the file, he claims Hitler is living in an underground residence somewhere in Argentina. He gives distances in miles from big cities, saying this hideout is hundreds of miles west of Florianopolis in Brazil and a few hundred miles northwest of Buenos Aires, hidden behind a light-sensitive wall that slides open to reveal a bunker. Whether or not that is true, the FBI has to take down every word. Then there is the money trail. The same cluster of documents mentions a woman identified in American and British intelligence as Mrs. Eichhorn, a wealthy German Argentine who runs a large spa hotel in the mountain town of La Falda in Córdoba province. According to FBI files, Mrs. Eichhorn boasted that she gave heavy financial support to the Nazi Party, especially to propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. She also claimed that when she and her husband visited Germany before the war, they stayed as guests of Hitler and offered their resort as a future refuge for him. Other documents in the same dossier paint La Falda and nearby areas as centers of strong pro-Nazi feeling, with underground cells and German organizations using the surrounding provinces as hiding places. A journalist named Johannes Steele, quoted in those files, describes the region as a hub where Nazi labor leaders were told to prepare safe houses for future fugitives. The Eden Hotel in La Falda, run by the Eichhorn family, even had a room reserved for Hitler, a private radio tower, and a dining room big enough for hundreds of guests. Later, known war criminals such as Adolf Eichmann visited the area while living in Argentina. Even if the idea of Hitler himself living at some ranch sounds wild, the surroundings described in the reports match what other intelligence officers are hearing. There really are pro-Nazi communities, money networks, and possible hiding places in the Argentine interior. The Los Angeles agent and his colleagues tried to catch the man in the same place where it all began. Notes from the file, echoed in later transcriptions, describe how agents watched the Melody Lane restaurant at Hollywood and Vine, hoping that the mystery informant might sit down there again. They never do. The lead that started in a busy lunch crowd simply dries up. The agent reaches out to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the office that tracks foreign arrivals, and asks them to check passenger lists and border cards for the names and aliases mentioned in the story. According to a later summary by historian Luke Daly Groves, the Bureau found nothing concrete that matched these claims, and Director J. Edgar Hoover would soon write that he had received no serious indication that Hitler was in Argentina at all. At the same time, the story about the submarines has to be tested. Naval intelligence has records for real German submarines that reached Argentina after the war, such as the boats that surrendered at Mar del Plata in the summer of 1945. But those logs show crews arriving without any famous passengers. Still, the agent's own memos show that he does not simply laugh off the tale. He passes copies of the report to Army and Navy contacts. He notes that the informant was supposedly paid a large sum of money for helping the operation, a figure later retold as $15,000, and that this man says the guilt has become too heavy for him to carry. By the late 1940s, files like this one have filled drawers. Many of them tell stories just as dramatic as the submarine tale and just as weak when the facts are checked. For the agent, it means week after week of talking to frightened sources, obvious hoaxers, and people who know enough about real Nazi networks to make every rumor feel like it might turn into something serious. But those years of chasing one missing dictator leave a different trail behind. While the Bureau fails to find any living Hitler in the Andes, its agents keep stumbling across other names from his army and from his wartime machine. One of those names belongs to a young prisoner of war who slipped out of a camp in the American Southwest and vanished into ordinary life. The hunt for that man will drag on not for a few months, but almost 40 years. America's longest Nazi manhunt. While the hunt for Hitler himself slowly faded, the folders on his followers kept getting thicker. The same system that once chased rumors about one missing dictator now had to deal with real men who had worn his uniform and were still not accounted for. In the late 1940s and 1950s, military courts tried some senior Nazis for war crimes. Others slipped away and later turned up in different countries. Over time, it became clear that some men who had served the Nazi state had also made their way to the United States by hiding or lying about their past. Different parts of the government picked up pieces of that problem. Army and Navy intelligence chased dangerous officers and spies in the first years after the fighting stopped. Justice Department lawyers worked on cases to remove known war criminals from the country. When new clues appeared, agents from the FBI helped with background checks, quiet interviews, and surveillance. Decades later, in the late 1970s, the Justice Department created a special unit called the Office of Special Investigations. Its job was to find Nazi persecutors who had slipped into the United States, take them to court, and if possible, push them out of the country. Over the years, that office opened hundreds of cases and helped strip citizenship or remove more than 100 offenders. Long before that office existed, the raw material for its work was already sitting in folders made by earlier agents. One of the strangest of those folders belonged to a man named Georg Gaertner. Gaertner had been a young soldier in the Afrika Korps, the German force that fought in North Africa under General Erwin Rommel. British troops captured him in North Africa in the middle of World War II and handed him to American forces. He was shipped across the ocean as a prisoner of war. A prisoner of war, often shortened to POW, is a captured soldier who is supposed to be held in a camp until the fighting ends and then sent home. He was moved between several camps inside America at a time when the United States held well over 400,000 German prisoners on its soil. In the last stage of his captivity, he ended up at a camp near the town of Deming in southern New Mexico. Like many other prisoners, he worked outside the fences on local jobs, handling supplies and doing basic labor. On paper, he was just another captured soldier waiting for a ship home. Inside, he was terrified of what home now meant. Gaertner had been born in the region of Silesia, in the eastern part of pre-war Germany. At the end of the war, that region fell under Soviet control and later became part of Poland. Reports of harsh treatment, arrests, and forced expulsions of Germans from those areas reached the camps. Gaertner became convinced that if he was sent back to Silesia, he could be imprisoned again, beaten, or even killed. He later said he would rather risk life as a fugitive in a foreign land than be handed over to Soviet rule. On a September night in 1945, at the age of 24, he made his move. At the Deming camp, the guards had relaxed their watch because the war was over, and most prisoners were calm. Gaertner studied the routine, waited for a moment when the lights were low, and slipped under the camp fence. From there, he walked to nearby train tracks and hid until a freight train approached. He climbed aboard and vanished into the rail network that crosses the American Southwest. By morning, the only sign of him at the camp was an empty bunk. On the American side, that empty bunk turned into a case file. The Army listed him among more than 2,200 German prisoners who had escaped at one point or another from camps in the United States. Almost all of those men were back in custody within hours or days. Gaertner was different. He never came back. In the late 1940s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation issued wanted posters with his face and description, and for years his name stayed on lists of long-term fugitives. For Gaertner himself, the next decades were not a dramatic chase with speedboats and gunfights. They were a slow, careful act that never really stopped. He chose a new name, Dennis F. Wiles, and moved from job to job and town to town, always trying to stay one step ahead of questions. He worked as a farmhand, a construction laborer, a draftsman, and a salesman. He picked up English, learned to answer basic questions about his past, and kept his story as plain as possible so no one would dig deeper. At one point, he became a ski instructor in the mountains of California, and later a tennis coach in Colorado, teaching people on snow and on courts while his face still sat on wanted notices. Even when the official search cooled, his fear did not. In the early 1960s, the Army quietly ended its manhunt, and federal interest in his case dropped, but his name stayed in the paperwork as an unresolved escape. He did not know that. He lived as if every knock at the door might be an agent. In the 1960s, he married an American woman named Jean, helped raise her children, and built a more stable life as a construction estimator and consultant. Friends knew him as a hard-working, slightly private man with a German accent. Only his wife knew how deep his secrecy really went, and even she did not know why. By the early 1980s, the strain inside the home was too much. Jean knew he was hiding something serious, but he refused to explain. At one point, he even left the country and went back to Germany for a while, which damaged their marriage further. When he returned to the United States, he realized he could not keep living halfway between two lives. In Colorado, he met a historian named Arnold Kramer, who studied the history of German prisoners of war in America and was already known for his work on that subject. Gaertner finally told him the truth about who he was and why he had escaped. Together, they began to turn his secret life into a book. An editor later gave it a sharp title that would stick to him forever: Hitler's Last Soldier in America. The way he chose to surrender was as unusual as his escape. In September of 1985, roughly 40 years after he slipped under the fence near Deming, Gaertner agreed to appear on a major morning television program in New York. Under his adopted name, he sat down in front of the cameras. Then he stated, on live television, that he was in fact the long-missing prisoner who had escaped from a camp in New Mexico just after the war. Officials from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the agency that handled foreign citizens, were waiting in the studio to take him into custody. The ending surprised nearly everyone, including Gaertner. Officials from the Immigration Agency and the Justice Department looked at his case and realized that it did not fit their usual patterns. He had been brought to the United States as a prisoner of war, not as someone who chose to immigrate. He had escaped not to commit new crimes, but to avoid being sent back to an area taken over by a hostile power. He had lived a quiet life, held steady jobs, and had no record of violent acts in America. There was no clear law that said what should happen to him now. After some debate, they chose not to charge him and allowed him to stay in the country as a legal resident. Years later, he even took the oath to become a citizen of the United States. By the time Gaertner settled into old age in Colorado, painting pictures and talking openly about his past, a new phase of the story was already waiting. When the Cold War was over, the reports that agents had typed about Hitler were sitting in cardboard boxes on government shelves. They were stamped, filed, and basically forgotten. If you were not an insider, you had no way to see what was in them. That only changed when Congress forced those cabinets open. In the late 1990s, lawmakers passed a rule called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. It told agencies like the FBI, the CIA, and Army intelligence to go back through their old Nazi-era files, pull out anything related to war crimes or Nazi suspects, and make it public unless there was a very strong reason not to. A special team called the Interagency Working Group was set up to push and supervise this work. Over the next years, that team oversaw the screening of well over 100 million pages, and more than 8 million pages of records were declassified under this law, including hundreds of thousands of pages from the FBI alone. Those pages were not just about camps and trials. They also included all the strange side stories that grew out of the war. Intelligence deals, Cold War bargains with former Nazis, and buried in the middle of it all, the rumors that Adolf Hitler might have survived. As part of a wider push for openness and freedom of information, the FBI also built an online reading room for old case files. They called it the Vault. Among the files it put up was one labeled simply with Hitler's name. The short note on that page explains that the documents in this file run from the early 1930s into the late 1940s, but focus on the years right after Germany's surrender, when many people feared that Hitler might have escaped. Now, for the first time, anyone can sit at home and read the same memos those agents wrote. Those are the newly opened notes that keep dragging people back to the question of what really happened to Hitler, even though the real answer has been buried in Berlin since 1945. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.